Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. It's on starting a food bank. The Global Food Banking Network has initiated this webinar along with a series of toolkits as resources to aid us in our work in our new food bank development program, which is intended to promote the establishment of food banks in communities where they don't already exist. Next slide, David. During this webinar, we're going to cover several different topics. We'll give a brief overview of the Global Food Banking Network and what we do. We'll talk about what a food bank is in the context of the Global Food Bank Network definition. We'll talk about assessing feasibility for the establishment of a food bank in a community, and talk about the planning process that's necessary to go through when approaching the development of a food bank. Most of the presentations will be in English. We will have one Spanish-speaking presenter, and so you'll notice at the bottom of your screen there's an interpretation button. You should select the English language or French if that's your primary language in that interpretation button, so that when we switch from one speaker to another, you'll be hearing all the presentations. Also, as you think of questions during the presentations, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type your question into that section. And when we get to the question and answer session at the end of the webinar, we'll address those questions that you deposit in that space. Next slide. So to begin, I would like to provide some context for GFN's work in helping to establish food banks. When GFN first started in 2006, it was with a dual mission of supporting food banks where they exist and helping to start food banks where they are needed. To date, we've assisted the development of food banking in nearly 20 countries. In a moment, you will hear a review of how we support food banks and how we approach strengthening their effectiveness to enhance their reach and their impact. You will then hear from several team members about how we approach the process of assisting local leaders who undertake to establish food banking for the first time in their communities. Finally, you will hear from one recently developed food bank regarding how engagement with GFN accelerated his food bank's development. Then we will take time to address your questions and your comments. So first, allow me to provide an overview of GFN's work today, supporting food banks and helping them to build their capacity and their capability. Next slide. We're all aware of the statistics. Nearly a third of all food produced is lost or wasted. More than 800 million people face hunger every day. The food that is lost or wasted could provide daily sustenance to those 800 million people. GFN believes food banks are key to building resilient food systems to connect this surplus with this need. Next slide. GFN's vision and mission are a world free of hunger and accomplished by helping to nourish the world's hungry through uniting and advancing food banks. We have 4 pillars in our approach to addressing this mission. The first is scaling, launching food bank organizations, promoting food secure communities. The second is empowering, building capacity and capability. Third, accelerating, leveraging product sourcing and enhancing access to more nutritious product. And finally, protecting, reaching the most vulnerable and expanding the work of food banks to help those most in need. Next slide. To give you a sense of scope and scale of the GFN network, we work with more than 778 food banks in 44 countries, distributing food last year to 40 million people through 59,000 community organizations that provide life-changing services and help on the path to self-sufficiency. Next slide. We believe local leaders know best what is needed, and we work to support them to establish and scale food banks, to increase community access to more nutritious food, expansion of vital services, and reduction of food loss and waste. Next slide. Our staff has combined food banking experience of well more than 250 years at both the local food bank level, working at national network level, and now at the global level. We target our technical assistance and the resources that we generate through our connection with our global partners to assist with enhancing the effectiveness and the efficiency of all areas of food bank administration and operation, helping to make sure that the organizational infrastructure is sound and solid, making sure that the resource development activities of the food bank are effective in bringing in the food and grocery products that are necessary for distribution, the finances that are necessary for underwriting the costs of the operations, and the in-kind resources like volunteerism and other resources like vehicles and access to physical infrastructure facilities and equipment and supplies for the day-to-day operations of the food bank. Next slide, please. So it's the positive growth of the network that drives our desire to help in more countries and more communities. It's our desire to see the number of food banks grow, the number of people reached grow, and that's the ultimate goal, that last one. So to set context, let me discuss how GFN defines what a food bank is. Next slide. Next slide. When GFN speaks of food banks, we are referring to an entity that distributes food and grocery products to the hungry at scale. Its goal is to achieve large-scale, broad, community-wide distribution. It's not a small food pantry operating in a community center or a church or mosque. A food bank operates without discrimination. Its services and products are made available to the community as a whole. A substantial proportion of the products it distributes are donated by commercial food establishments and sometimes by government. It's not simply a nonprofit buyer of food that it then redistributes. Food banks may purchase product to complement their inventories, but purchases are not typically the primary source of product. A food bank depends upon successfully established and maintained alliances with a broad base of stakeholders throughout the public sector, the private sector, and all segments of civil society. These alliances provide the lifeblood of the food bank and make it an integral part of the community. So for this reason, among others, a food bank is typically and ideally an NGO. While governments may and have been involved in starting food banks as community service programs of their own, they typically spin the food bank off as an NGO. Next slide, please. So how do food banks work? As you see in the graphic on the presentation, on the left-hand side are the various segments of the supply chain, from farms and fisheries, down through manufacturing and distribution, down to the retail level, grocery markets, restaurants, hospitality, even consumers through food drives, and sometimes from governments with commodities that they may purchase for price protection purposes, for example. All of these points of the supply chain present opportunities for donation of product. That product is collected into the food bank and then distributed out, typically to a network of community service organizations who in turn pass it along to people who are facing hunger. Some food banks additionally provide distribution directly to people who are in need. But the majority of times, the distribution goes through community service organizations. Next slide, please. There are a couple of different operating models of food banks. The core food bank model is a warehouse-based model. It reflects the graphic that we had in the previous slide, and is based on pulling product into a central distribution facility and then redistributing it out to retail level distribution through community organizations. There are some common additional models that are in place in many food banks around the world. One is a prepared food model. In this particular model, the food bank is dealing more with prepared food coming from catering venues, from hotels, from restaurants, and they're taking that prepared food directly from the donor to the beneficiaries using vehicles that are equipped with the supplies and the equipment to make sure that the food is protected in terms of food safety management to ensure that no one gets sick from the transport of the food. Typically, the food is chilled or frozen by the donor and then distributed to the community service organization, which intends to use it immediately or within hours if it's frozen. But the product is not typically brought back into a warehouse and stored for any length of time. It's a more immediate distribution process. Another common model that has developed in food banks around the world is what we refer to as virtual food banking. In this situation, the food bank never actually touches the product at all, and the typical donor to virtual food banking activity are grocery stores, retail levels operations. And in such cases, there could be really valuable product, dairy product, fresh fruits and vegetables, bakery product, but usually the volume of the donation is significantly smaller than would be justified for a food bank to operate a fleet of trucks running around on routes to pick it all up. And so what the food bank does is it acts as a matchmaker with specially trained community-based organizations and donors, so that the community-based organization, which may be in the neighborhood of the grocery store, will go and pick the product up every day. It will transmit back to the food bank data about what it received, the volume, the type of product that was received. And so the distribution happens directly from the donor to the beneficiary entity, but the food bank manages the relationship between the two and accounts for the aggregate of donations that come from, say, the entire chain of retailers to the entire network of beneficiaries that they're supplying the product to. Next slide. Organizational infrastructure is an important component of a food bank. It depends on the model that the food bank is following. It's important to consider what types of food are going to be handled and in what volume, and what kind of collection and distribution is necessary in order to address the types and volume of food, always keeping in mind food safety management and the important requirements around storage to ensure that the food is always wholesome and always in good shape when it's being distributed out to its beneficiaries. So likely needs will center around facility, vehicles, equipment, technology, and the distribution network, the community-based organizations that the food bank is supplying the product to. Next slide, please. The food bank is a community asset. One of the best definitions I heard, or descriptions I heard of this concept, came from a member of the city council of a large city here in the United States several years ago when we were doing a training program. And that person from the city council said, the city council and the mayor think about our food bank the same way we think about the police and fire departments and the education and healthcare systems. It is essential to sustaining a healthy city. It's a great comment, and it's a great recognition of the outcomes of food banking. And speaking of the outcomes of food banking, allow me to introduce now the Global Food Banking Network's Vice President of Programs, Doug O'Brien, and he's going to speak specifically about food bank outcomes. Doug, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Chris has described the model of food banking and its characteristics and how it is adapted to various contexts in different communities around the world. I'm going to describe a little bit about the outcomes and the principles that underlie the food bank model to achieve those outcomes. Globally, enough food is produced to provide adequate nutrition for all people every day with surplus. Even with population growth and the trend toward urbanization, this has remained true since the 1970s. The problem is not adequate production of food. The problem is access to food. Food access for economically disadvantaged and marginalized communities is the challenge reflected in food insecurity and hunger rates to which food banks exist to address. We've seen a troubling change in the hunger and food security landscape just in the past year with the COVID crisis. The number of people deemed food insecure and hungry grew, reversing more than a decade of progress. These numbers have been updated from the slide you're seeing just now by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. And today, an estimated tenth of the entire global population, between 720 million and 820 million people, were undernourished last year. Globally, 2.4 billion people were deemed food insecure. That is, they lacked sufficient access to nutritious food. And that's an increase of nearly 320 million people in just 1 year. That also includes 149 million children under 5 affected by stunting, and 370 million children who missed out on school meals in 2020 because of school closures related to the pandemic. The food bank model has existed for more than half a century. It now operates in more than 80 countries around the world, of which GFN represents a very large proportion, especially in emerging, developing, middle income and lower income countries. And an estimated more than 100 million people globally have access and receive food access to the food bank model. The food bank model is an important means to address hunger and food insecurity at the community level closest to where it's experienced. Food banks provide this essential food access. They can supply more nutritious food that may be affordable for many families and can fill in gaps in social protections for economically disadvantaged people. Next slide, please. Well, the world produces enough food. Too many lack that access, and far too much is lost and wasted throughout the supply chain. As my colleague Chris noted, is that a third of all food produced from even the earliest stages of the supply chain at the farm and fishery level, all the way to the end user, is lost or wasted at different parts of the supply chain. The cost of this food loss and waste is immense, and it's a terrible misuse of natural, financial, and human resources. As has been communicated a great deal in this past year with the United Nations Food Systems Dialogues, this level of food loss and waste is not just irresponsible when so many are food insecure and hungry, but food loss and waste threatens our climate and the prospects of future agricultural productivity and human potential. By recovering food excess and reducing wholesome, safe food from ending up in landfills and redirecting that to feed the hungry, a circular economic activity is established at the community level, closest to where these challenges occur. Food banks, when they're scaled, serve an important role to strengthen the food system and aiding in food system resilience, providing an efficient model of covering surplus and redirecting for social and environmental impact. Throughout the world, food banks operate at the nexus between SDG 2, towards zero hunger, and SDG 12.3, to have food loss and waste, mobilizing local networks of voluntary grassroots organizations and leading local initiatives that help transform lives and communities that lead then to global impact, providing a green intervention to reduce hunger. Next slide, please. To most effectively do this, food banks operate within a broad cross-section of community from both the public and private sector. As Chris noted, some food banks may have been established by government or they cooperate with government, but it is indeed the linkage between the public sector and government and the private sector, broadly described as civil society, that creates a framework to help address these community challenges. Linking businesses from across the supply chain with government and public aims, and linking beneficiary agencies, academic institutions, faith organizations, neighborhood associations, and other elements of society, all towards a common purpose. As such, the food bank becomes the hub of cooperation, leading to community action to address the needs of economically disadvantaged people in that community. This essential role cannot be understated, especially to the vulnerable people directly affected by food insecurity. As noted by the World Bank Group, the pivotal role of food security is central to any poverty response, as food access is the key priority among people living in poverty, absorbing most of their financial, mental, emotional, and long-term resources. And as such, without a community-led response, too many will be left behind. The United Nations reports that only half of the world's population has access to government social protections meant to either lift people out of poverty or to soften the blows that comes with having economic disadvantage. If only half of the world's population has access to government social protections, it's even more troubling that another half has none. Community action, like that represented by food banks, can both fill the gap in social protection and build a pathway to establishing new social protections. As we've witnessed before and during the COVID emergency, food banks can be the local leader in better food access, poverty alleviation, gender equity, and improved educational outcomes, to name just a few. The impact of food banking today is substantial, with the COVID emergency providing the most recent example of the essential role food banks have in strengthening our communities and the potential for expanding this model, which is why you're here today and why GFN exists, to reach underserved areas now with a model and uniting through tools and technical assistance, better means for communities to address these challenges in their midst. Now to dive deeper into this, I will turn this over to my colleague, Ana Catalina, to help you think through the process of feasibility in your context and in your community's needs. Ana?
Gracias, Doug. Lo primero es que les
Thank you, Doug. First of all, I invite you to click on the interpretation button to go into the Spanish channel. I'm Ana Catalina Suarez, Regional Director for Latin America for GFN. Thank you to everybody who's listening now. Again, I invite you to leave your questions or comments in the Q&A section in the chat. We will be answering those questions towards the end of the session. We'll have a Q&A session. First of all, I would like to uh, tell you we know that you're planning on establishing a food bank right now in your country, in your region, in your city. And I think it's very important that in order to do this, first we conduct a feasibility study. And there's four major points in this feasibility evaluation and as a part of this presentation.
Next slide,
Let's move on
please.
to the next slide. Thank you. For the feasibility evaluation, there are four basic elements that we take into account. First of all, the people who need our services. Why? Because the most important thing that food banks do, and Doug and Chris said this already, the focus is the population that we serve, is reducing hunger, is ending poverty, is reaching those who most need us. With the feasibility assessment, the first thing we do is we locate the population that needs our help. The population that needs us, all the geographical and demographical data. Demographical data, we're talking about sex, how many male, women in the territory, how many people need food assistance. We're talking about different age groups, school age children, or uh, population who is homeless or the elderly. So we need to understand the context, the population that needs this assistance in my community, in my city. And also we need to take into account the geographical context. We know that the highest indexes of poverty occur in rural areas because of the connection or lack thereof, connection with educational systems, with health systems. So we need to understand uh, urban poverty, rural poverty. That's absolutely relevant as we conduct our feasibility study for the bank, because the service we're going to provide is going to be based on that. And also, we need to implement a non-discrimination policy for GFN. The food banks that belong to the network have to implement a clear non-discrimination policy. They have to assist all populations regardless of race, religion, political ideas, etc. Another relevant issues, well, we need to have the data. We need to identify the most reliable sources of data in my country about the populations, demographics, geographical situation, etc. Because the reason for food banks to exist are those people who need our help. So in the next uh, presentation, next slide, if we can move on, please, we're going to discuss the current services environment. What is that like in my country, my region, in my city? This is very important because we will be creating a food bank, as Doug was saying, in an environment where there is already maybe some philanthropic institution, there's some assistance to the population. So we need to understand what organizations already exist in the territory, uh, what they're doing for the population, if there's educational institutions or institutions that help the homeless, how they work with those groups, how do they operate in the territory, what base organizations exist in the communities, in the neighborhoods, whom are they helping, what services they offer. This is therapy, services, immigration, uh, uh, lunches or breakfast. What is the type of service that they offer, and how can they benefit from the assistance of a food bank? But it's not just that. It's also absolutely relevant that we understand what are the national and international partners that I can count on to implement a food bank in my country, my region. Are those allies or partners that I could work with, or could they provide funding? So, and we have to look at the whole spectrum. We can find allies in institutions that work with vulnerable populations. We have also, we can have partners who are working on ending poverty or ending hunger or improving the nutritional health of the populations we serve. So by bringing food, we can support, for example, training and educational programs. By delivering food, we can also help educational programs for children of school age. So the food bank is the perfect ally for all those programs that reach vulnerable populations. But it's very important to understand where the service gaps exist, both geographic and programmatic. And when we talk about gaps, we're talking about who are the people who are not being attended to, who are not being assisted, which rural areas, which urban areas are not covered by those organizations that exist in the territory, and also programmatic gaps. Maybe there's a lack of entities that helps the elderly, or institutions that help uh, newborns or the first 1,000 days and nutritional issues. So we need to identify those institutions that exist already, the programmatic gaps, and see where food banks can add value. Next slide, please.
Next slide.
In the third phase of the assessment phase, the feasibility evaluation, feasibility assessment, there's an important things. In English, we call it the three F's: funds, food, and friends. These are three core resource pillars. It's important because this way we can think about the bank today and the bank in the future. First of all, where can my funds, my resources come from? As Chris mentioned in his presentation, I need a bank based on some of the models that we discussed, a bank with a warehouse, or a bank that can rescue food from the hospitality sector, from hotels, or a virtual bank. And but being a virtual bank doesn't mean that it doesn't have to have resources to support the organizations, or resources to identify the assistance gaps. We will always need resources. So this organization we're creating, this food bank, could it uh, be able to raise funds? Are there organizations that can help to establish the organization? What's the philanthropy environment in my area, in my country? Do we have international and national donors who would be interested in models like this one? And also, it's important to uh, have the data to offer to those partners. How do we convince them that we have the data and we want to reduce hunger and poverty? And also the other important part, which is we want to reduce the food loss and waste. There are many banks, food banks in the world, who also uh, solicit resources or ask for resources from the beneficiary organizations that they serve to pay for collection efforts on the part of the bank, distribution, selection efforts so that they can distribute quality foods, and for the whole process. So those organizations are asked for support for this. Is there the right environment among the organizations in your country to request for resources for or funds for the service that we provide? This is very important. Next slide. We're going to talk about funds. That's very important. Chris showed that. Where do the resources for food banks come? Where does the food come from? The most of the food that we receive are donated products, products that were not able to be marketed because they do not comply with marketing standards, but they still comply with standards for human consumption. That means that it is very important that we understand that there is a agricultural base, there's an agricultural sector that maybe allows me to rescue food for that vulnerable population. What's the situation with that food? What shape is it in? Second, is there a food production industry or uh, any organizations are committed to zero waste and are willing to deliver products to the food bank? What are these industries? Are they national, international? Can I reach them? Can I contact them? And then distributors, retailers, supermarkets, stores. Who are those companies that exist in my country? A distributor is very important because they contact, they're the nexus between the industry, the retailer, distribution. The distributors in many places end up being the owners of that product. How can we invite those distributors to be our allies? And last but not least, restaurants and hotels. How many restaurants and hotels are there in my city, my region, my country? Can I reach out to them? Could I contact them and invite them to join the food bank? Being able to conduct this assessment phase will help us understand what are the real opportunities for working that I have in my country in food rescue. And because without food to distribute, there's no food bank. On some occasions, and this was mentioned, we need to acquire food, we need to purchase food, but primarily we rescue food to deliver it to those who most need it. And finally, we're talking about vulnerable populations. How do we deliver food to them with dignity? And in order to do that, we need to comply with high quality standards that allow for selection process, for receiving process, classification, distribution of food. And for that purpose, I need a logistical operation. I might find partners that are willing to support me in establishing that logistical operation for the population that we're serving. So it's really fundamental. We need to identify those resources. And again, last but not least, the volunteers. We have countries in which 60 to 70% of the selection and classification process of food in the bank is done through volunteers. Uh, do you think you could have volunteers in your countries, in your regions, in your cities? They are really, again, absolutely necessary. So, uh, not only volunteers for the selection of food, but also we need volunteers on communication issues, financial issues. We need consultants on logistical issues. What are the opportunities that we have with that type of volunteer to support the organizations that we assist and to provide the service that they provide? So we can have volunteers on operational issues and knowledge transfer, and those are absolutely important. Next.
Next slide.
Thank you. I'm getting here to the last item, and this is incredibly important. And it is to understand the legal and regulatory issues that exist in your country. And we do this, we're going to have a lot of partners. These partners are going to be national companies, local companies, and they're going to expect from us that we are a legally, bound organization, that we know what the regulations are, what the legal regulations are, what is there in our country that regulates our type of organization. What are the permits or licenses that are needed? What kind of documentation we need to give the local, regional, and national authorities? So this is information that is, that has to do with not only legal issues, but also health issues. So we need to understand what the health regulations are and how they apply, which regulatory agencies are responsible for food safety. We have to follow all the rules, all the guidelines, but we also have to do it for legal reasons, and we have to do it because of our relationship with our partners and with our allies and with our donors. And we're getting products from the agricultural sectors and the industrial sectors, and we get food from restaurants and hotels. So when somebody when somebody is an organization that has been legally built, they expect for all their partners to be the same. And we also need to understand the system. We need to understand what the system is for donation of products in your country. And this is something that's very important when you work with your partners. You need to understand when when you donate to a food bank in your country, what are the benefits that the company can derive from the donation, and then you can show to your donors or to your partners, this is what you would get. And the first reason for the donation is always to end hunger, and the second one is always end food loss and waste. And then of course there is the reputation. This company can now say that they donate to a food bank to donate food products and hunger. And lastly, we want to identify if the government supports organizations such as food banks. And when food banks normally are not government run, but it's important that at all levels of government, the government identifies the bank as a community asset, as somebody who works on hunger and to eliminate food waste and loss. And we want to make sure that we know exactly how to work with the government, and that is very important for the food bank. And next. So we talked about several things. At the end of the day, this feasibility study lets you know what is the population needs your services, where are they, and what do they need from us. Then it should also tell us what is the environment that exists, service environment, what type of services are available to the general population in your country. If there is a trend to philanthropy, people donate. If there are resources, people that can support you and add value to what you're doing. The third thing is we need to find allies, partners. Who are they? Where are they? And there are maybe partners, people that I can work with, create agreements. And the fourth one, and less important, is what's the legal environment in which we're going to be working? What is the legal environment that exists in my country, and what is the legal environment and all the rules and laws that I have to follow in terms of health, in terms of regulations. And I need to make sure that I know what the local, regional, and national governments demand from us. So once we can answer all these questions, we're ready to proceed. We can start a food bank, we can improve, and we can get more information eventually. But those that answer these questions say, well, yes, we're ready to go on, we're ready to start the food bank. Then I'm going to give Chris the microphone, the word, so he can continue.
Thank you, Anna. So assuming that you have completed your feasibility assessment and the findings indicate that the conditions would support a food bank in your community, how do you approach designing what that food bank should look like and what will be needed to launch its operations? In this next few minutes, we're going to take the time to look at who should be involved in putting together the business plan, what should be addressed in the plan, what will it cost, and where will the funds come from? There are two different plans that need to be developed. One is the business plan, which will define the operations and the infrastructure of the organization. And the second is how to capitalize the launch and the sustainability of the organization over the first couple of years of operation. It's really important that you put together an effective planning infrastructure at the beginning, and inclusivity is absolutely key. You want to have a core team of people who are the leaders of the project, who will be focused on managing the project all the way through, and will be focused on enlisting the people that are needed from the various sectors, from the public sector, the private sector, from throughout civil society, to participate in the planning forum. And the core team needs to define the planning timeline, and set the tone and the structure for the approach to planning. In the end, the process will generate a couple of different end products, primarily the business plan and the capitalization plan. Next slide, please. So who should sit at the table? Who should be part of planning for the food bank? In order to answer that question, it's important to define what the concept and role of the food bank is going to be. Who owns it? And who is it being created to serve? Who will be the stakeholders that help provide that service? And what will be the scale and scope of services that it's going to offer in the community? Ultimately, in the end, collaboration and leveraging relationships, leveraging partnerships are what will lead to successful planning and then successful launch of the operations. Next slide, please. So this is set up kind of like an organizational chart, but it's not really an organizational chart, other than the to suggest that the box that you see here labeled Forum for Food Security is really the overarching group that should be involved in putting together planning, and all the rest of the boxes just identify different sectors of society from all three of the sectors: private sector, public sector, and civil society, that should be involved. And as you look at those groups, you'll identify that that they're very broad, and some you might not necessarily initially associate with food banking, but every group on here, every sector or segment of the society that's represented in these boxes, in fact, has something to do with the development of the food bank and with the successful launching of food bank operations. And you'll hear a little bit more about that as we go through the process of the plan development. Next slide, please. One thing that it's important for the core team to recognize, the leadership of the planning process to recognize, is that there will be costs associated with planning, and it won't be high costs. It won't require a lot of money, but as you work to have a very inclusive group of people pulled together, there will be costs related to renting meeting space, or potentially for people to travel to get to meetings that you hold in the planning process. You may be providing lunch or breakfast at meetings. You're going to be needing to conduct research, and there may be costs associated with that and with the report writing that comes as a result of that research. And then just general back office support, printing and copying and those kinds of expenses. So right from the very beginning, it's important to recognize that there will be expenses related to the planning, and it will be important that the leadership, the core team, identify people who would have the resources and be willing to provide those resources to underwrite those kinds of costs. Next slide, please. There will be several deliverables, as we mentioned before: the business plan, the financial plan, which is part of the business plan, and then the resource development plan. Next slide. The business plan is going to ultimately be the roadmap for the establishment of the food bank. It's going to define everything about the food bank, what its purpose is, what its vision, its mission are, the values by which it's going to operate. It's going to define what kind of an organization it is. In different countries, there are different approaches to nonprofit law, and in some countries, the food bank could potentially be established, be registered as one of several different kinds of models, as a foundation or as an association, or as a trust, as some other kind of organization. So it's important to have legal counsel involved in the planning process to identify, based on the mission and the vision of the food bank, what is the most appropriate legal structure for the food bank to be registered as. And then who's going to provide governance and management of the organization, and what kind of staffing infrastructure is going to be needed, and within that staffing infrastructure, which positions need to be, for accountability purposes and effective management purposes, which staff positions need to be paid employees and which can be volunteers. And of course, in most cases, you're going to have a much higher percentage of volunteer engagement than you are paid employees. But paid employees are important in a number of different areas. And again, you'll see a little bit more about that later on. Overall administration, what kind of policies are going to be put in place to govern the administration of the organization, to govern the operations of the organization, and to set the tone and the approach for how you will engage with stakeholders on the outside. What kind of hard infrastructure is necessary? Facility, vehicles, equipment, racking in the warehouse, for example, or forklifts in the warehouse, office equipment, computers and desks and that sort of thing. Based on the research that you did in the feasibility assessment section, what kind of program design are you going to pursue? What will be the primary model of the food bank, and what kind of program definition is going to be necessary in order to effectively deliver that model? What are the operations issues that are going to be necessary? What kinds of logistics concerns? What kind of data management resources are you going to need? How are you going to get product donated to the food bank? Who's going to do that? And what will be your approach in soliciting those donations? What's your distribution infrastructure going to look like? Who are the community organizations that you're going to try to engage with to distribute the product that the food bank receives? And what kind of partners do you need to make all of that happen? And how are you going to communicate with those partners and market the mission and the services of the food bank in order to build awareness and drive resource development? Next slide, please. Once you've defined all of that, you can begin to attach numbers, financial numbers, to what the costs are going to be. You know, how much will it be to pay rent on a warehouse, and will you lease vehicles or buy vehicles, and how much will the cost be, not just to acquire the vehicles, but to operate them? You need salaries for drivers, perhaps. You need to purchase fuel. You need to have insurance on the vehicles. You need maintenance costs for the vehicles. You're going to need to put together collateral materials for resource development purposes, both food sourcing as well as fundraising. And what will be the cost related to putting together those collateral materials? What other staff are you going to need to hire, and what will be the salaries that will be attached to that? And aside from salaries, what additional costs of personnel are there? Taxes to the payroll taxes to the government, or the cost of benefits that you provide to the employees. All of these kinds of costs need to be anticipated in order to draft a startup budget and first year operations budget. But then we strongly recommend that you put together a 3-year projected budget. And the reason for that is so that you don't just raise the money to go ahead and launch the operation and get out there and get partway through your first year and realize that you're not being successful enough at your ongoing fundraising to sustain operations through your second year, and you have to cut back on activity because you're not going to have sufficient funding in the second year or in the third year. That's the worst thing that you could experience. You don't want to go through launching an operation that makes kind of a moral commitment to the community for the service that you're providing, only to find that you can't sustain it and you have to cut back on the scope and the scale of activity in the second year or third year because of failed fundraising. So you want to project out a multiple year budget so that you can make realistic projections about your ability to keep the organization sustained. Next slide, please. So we have a kind of a sample operating and capital budget here just to help you think through the kinds of expenses that would be necessary to anticipate and to build into that financial plan. Next slide, please. So then is the development of the capitalization plan. Now you know what it is you're going to do. You know what the cost is going to be, both your initial costs to launch operations as well as your ongoing costs for the first couple of years of operations. And so now you can put together your capitalization plan, identify where you're going to go to raise that money. What based on the research you did in the feasibility assessment, you've got a good handle now on what philanthropy looks like in your country, where potential funding resources exist, and your capitalization plan will build out the strategies and the tactics that you want to employ to be able to approach those potential resource providers and build the resource base that you need for the operations. Next slide, please. Think always in terms of taking advantage of opportunities for in-kind donation, but don't overestimate the value of in-kind donation. And let me explain a little bit what I mean there. So in your capitalization plan, in your financial plan, and then your capitalization plan, you've gone through and identified what operating costs you have, what hard asset costs you have, like for vehicles or equipment, you know, and office furniture and that sort of thing. And you always want to think about it, and you always want to budget for it as though it is actual and real cost. But you always have the potential that some of those items that you need, you can get donated in kind. You still want to reflect them in your budget. Because it is a real cost. If you can't get it in kind, you're going to have to purchase it. So you want it to be reflected in your financial plan, and you create cost savings when you're able to generate an in-kind donation, but you still need to account for it in case you can't generate the in-kind donation. And in-kind can come in a really, really broad base of support, right? You may get somebody who loans you a warehouse and doesn't charge you anything for it. You may get companies to donate vehicles to you and you don't have to purchase them. You may get a company to donate the racking for your warehouse because they're replacing racking in their warehouse, and instead of throwing away their old racking, they could give it to you. You may get somebody to donate a forklift to you for your warehouse because they're replacing a forklift that has completely depreciated on their balance sheet, and rather than trading it in against the new purchase for themselves, the relative value of that trade-in could be represented in the transfer of that used piece of equipment to you, and it's a small charitable donation on their part. To be able to do that, but for you, it's huge because it's a free forklift, right? So you need to be sure that you don't just think, okay, we can get these kinds of things donated, therefore we're not building them into the financial plan. You have to anticipate that you're going to have to pay for everything, and then chase in kind where you can and take advantage of that as a cost savings. but be sure that you include it in your plan. Because if you don't, and then you don't have the resources to buy it, you delay your ability to launch your operation. So then the last question you see on this slide is, when is enough enough? Can I launch operations when I have 50%, when I have 60%? Do I need to wait till I have 100%? You know, that's going to vary from country to country, and it's going to vary based on a number of different circumstances. And that's something that, as you go through the planning process, there needs to be serious dialogue among the folks involved in the planning process, based on their experience as business operators, both nonprofit and for-profit business operators, on what the potential environment in the community looks like in order to help you make the decision about when to pull the trigger and be able to set into the day-to-day operations of your food bank. So now that we've walked through all the process of assessing feasibility and building your business plan and your capitalization plan, I know that one of your first questions is, how can GFN help me with all of that? So in order to address that question, I'm going to bring back our Vice President of Programs, Doug O'Brien. And after Doug talks about how GFN can help, we're going to hear from a relatively young food bank in West Africa, talking about the establishment of his food bank and the role that GFN played in helping him to advance its launch. Doug?
Thank you, Chris. As you've heard thus far, the GFN exists to aid the development of your food bank and food banks around the world, and uniting food banks for shared purpose to provide food access for greater food security and a preferred means to reduce food loss and waste. Food banks as community-led organizations reflect local priorities, and those are different community by community. And they are rooted in the communities in which they are formed. And as such, their leadership and staff are closest to where these problems and challenges exist. And it's an important undertaking that you're considering now, which, when you operate to scale, can serve as an essential lifeline to the food insecure in your locality. It can build civil society and aid in more resilient and equitable food systems. GFN brings global and regional resources to meet local needs. And to do this, we share technical assistance, networks, partnerships, and other resources across borders and cultures to help you achieve the impact that you and your stakeholders believe are most important in your community. Those resources include toolkits to guide you through each phase of the process, technical assistance through remote and in-person when we're able to travel again, through phone and Zoom. In the meantime, introduction to GFN member food banks who can help mentor and share experiences and best practices, and then potential introductions to global corporate partners. Again, GFN looks at the global perspective and tries to bring these resources locally. To help give a good example of this work, I'd like to introduce one of our outstanding new members, Chef Elijah Amu Ado, who is the executive director and founder of Food for All Africa in Ghana, who's had enormous success in a very short period of time, having a great deal of community impact. Chef Elijah, can I turn it over to you?
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thanks to GFN for this opportunity. I must say that reflecting back a few years ago when I started the initiative of seeking the needed support from the Global Food Banking Network, it's been an amazing journey. I've learned a lot. I want to take it from the point, it all started from 2016 when we started thinking about how to connect excess food from the food supply chain. As a professional chef, I look beyond the hospitality sector to connect excess food to those who don't have purchasing power. I must confess, as at that time, there was quite a limited information on food banking in sub-Saharan Africa, especially West Africa to be specific. But I think I got in touch with Mr. Chris, and I got to realize they had actually had the opportunity of coming to Ghana to even initiate food banking as a model to support the Ghana school feeding program. And I thought that was the first time I actually heard about the global food banking network. And for me, immediately I started creating that network because I believe so much that for food banking to work, it's a community asset, just like it was said earlier. I saw this hard work from GFN that had people in the field picking food products and then written boldly on it. Food banking is a community asset. And that was the key word that transformed the organization from the initial stage of being passion to bringing all the key stakeholders together. Because definitely, yes, there's a chef who has passion to feed people, but feeding the people from that statement means that it's a collective project. So I started mobilizing stakeholders. It wasn't quite easy. But for me, each stage was a learning process for us, bringing together the various stakeholders. We looked at various stakeholders from the point of stakeholders within the public sector, within the private sector, as well as within the CSO's platform. And from that stage, we started thinking about the same one opportunity to that I'm so much grateful for GFN for is the e-learning platform. The e-learning platform at the initial stages created the room for us to learn on the various points that Chris touched on in terms of the planning stage and all that. So the e-learning platform gives us a good opportunity to build the right structures, the right networks, and the right partnerships. Fast forward to 20, in as much as we had all these structures in place and all that, sustainability became a challenge for us because at that stage, we were looking more at, like other food banks where they collect, they charge some fee from their beneficiaries, charities and the rest. This is a country where we're now building the prospects of food banking across the supply chain to most stakeholders, especially the private sector. So it was quite a challenge to be charging a subscription fee from beneficiaries. But then it serves also as a good platform to look at how we can use the local structures we have available together with the knowledge and expertise that we derive from the global food banking network to build a model that suits how we run. And it's been quite an interesting journey. It's been we're learning each day. And for us, most transformative this past 2 years, started all the way from 2019 when we were fortunate to be selected into the incubator program, the GFN incubator program. that program gave us the opportunity to meet other food banks from sub-Saharan Africa, emerging projects too. And it gave us the opportunity to learn, especially from the Food Forward South Africa. And for us, the processes that we've derived from this learning experience over the years has been very instrumental in the growth in which we are experiencing now. And for us, it's a great opportunity. And we see food banking as a community asset. And that's why we say it's a shared social responsibility. Once again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Elijah. At this point, we're going to step back and take some time for question and answer. And my colleague, Anthony Kitchen, is going to moderate this section for us.
Okay, so thank you, Chris. Thank you, Elijah, as well for that, for sharing that. It's been inspiring to see the growth that you and your team have achieved in Ghana over the last few years, and see the trajectory that you're still on, and the programs that you've launched. So thank you very much for sharing with us. So I'm Anthony Kitchen. I'm the Director of Programs at GFN. And as Chris mentioned, I'm just going to moderate this next section of the webinar, which is your opportunity to ask questions based on a lot of information that we've just presented to you. So thank you for those who have already written in questions. If you do have questions, please do type them in the Q&A box. You should be able to see the icon for that Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But I'm going to dive right into the first question. So, and Chris and Doug, you can decide who wants to take this one. Doug, I think this might be up your street. So, who from government should be involved in planning? And can you still proceed with planning and indeed launching a food bank if you do not get a response from government, or if they're just sort of not willing to support financially or in other ways?
Sure. So I think that both from my experience and what we've seen around the globe is it's always best to reach out to those stakeholders that are most tied to the work of the food bank, either from social protection or food safety or regulatory spheres, to let them know that, what you're thinking about to establish a food bank. They can oftentimes, if not directly aiding the development of the food bank or its establishment, they can sometimes bring their own networks of business contacts or other stakeholders to the table to help you advance the establishment of the model. So that outreach, I think, is important, because you really can't operate a food bank outside at least some level of government context. It's the nature of the way we recover food. Is that food is somehow unmarketable, it's still nonetheless subject to food safety restrictions, requirements, and as such, you will be interacting with government in the normal course of duty of operating a food bank. You'll be working with government in the establishment of the nonprofit or non-governmental organizational rules of your country. And so in each of these instances, you'll want to have those contacts. If they don't directly support, still making that information available, what your aims are and the purpose for your existence, oftentimes can, as you move down that path, develop those partnerships and relationships going forward. Over time, as we've seen in different parts of the globe, is that over time, government can see that value and then can start to direct resources, whether it be food or funds, very directly into what you're doing. So at every stage, I think it's a good idea to do that outreach, primarily first and foremost with those agencies that the food bank would most likely touch initially, and then build that out. And certainly working with elected leaders, the legislators, is always a good idea as well, because your action it's a community action, therefore reflects the needs of the people. And in many contexts, those are voters and legislators and local government officials, municipal officials, want to take credit or participate in the good work that you're doing.
And if I could jump in, and at the risk of stating the obvious, Doug makes a really good point that you should try and engage all of those different people who have some regulatory or statutory relationship to what the food bank is going to be doing, like food safety management or the Department of Social Development or the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Agriculture. But when you face the situation where they won't engage with you, you absolutely do want, as Doug suggests, to keep them informed, but also then make sure that you have adequate legal counsel as part of your planning process to ensure that whatever the legal requirements are around food safety management or fiscal responsibility or those kinds of things gets adequately addressed in the development of your business plan, so that you don't find yourself launching operations and then being subject to a fine or a problem because you haven't anticipated all the correct statutory and regulatory implications in the design of your administration and your operations. So if you can't get government to engage and help you with all of that themselves, just make sure that you engage adequate legal counsel to be sure that you're touching all those bases.
Thank you. We've also got a few questions now about the sort of practical aspects of actually conducting these detailed planning phases. And Chris, both you and Anna, in your sections of the presentation, outlined a lot of research that it's very recommended to do ahead of launching, and research that then really does feed in as major inputs into your detailed planning and business planning. Do you have any suggestions or tips regarding either how or indeed who you should recruit to do that research?
Yeah, there are a couple of approaches that you can take. One is to early in your development of the planning process, when you're putting together the core team that we talked about, the kind of the local leadership team that's going to manage the research and the planning development. It's important to reach out to the academic community, reach out to universities and engage them in the process. And oftentimes you'll find a resource within the universities' research departments where they might be willing to take on some aspect of the feasibility analysis, for example, or the entire feasibility analysis as a project for a research team, a research class or course that they are providing. And they would engage the students and the professors involved in that course to take on that research as an educational process for the students. And the benefit, obviously, to you is that you get the value of their research report to provide your assessment of feasibility. And similarly, you can engage groups like that in the development of various business plan activity. Also, look at, especially on the business plan development, look at some of the partners that you bring in from the private sector, from various corporations that you can establish relationship with. And within a particular corporation, you may have a skills-based volunteer opportunity to have someone who's focused on planning and sustainability and that kind of aspect of the corporate function, who might be willing to, if not conduct the development of the plan on your behalf, perhaps manage the development of the plan, and then using their networks, they could employ people who would be knowledgeable and experienced in business plan development and financial plan development, who could come and help you with that. So you want to always look keep in mind that what you're planning for is the establishment of a business, right? You're planning for the establishment of a food distribution business. It happens to be nonprofit, not commercial, but functionally it's the same thing. So if you think of it in that kind of context and that kind of scale, then you'll get more creative thought about who the potential stakeholders that are in the public sector and in civil society that you may want to tap to be part of the planning process, who bring that expertise to the table.
If I might just also add is that government here again, especially at the closest levels to where you would be operating, can also be quite helpful. Governments, local and national, have the same aim. They want to provide some level of social protection, but frequently lack the resources to adequately do so. And so they do look to civil society partners, such as the food bank, to help provide some of these benefits. In addition, as far as the research side, they also want to reduce food loss and waste. So there's great attention to agricultural markets or food production activity that goes on within the country, and are willing to share that information that can help guide you in your thinking. Placing or having a food bank near where food production or commercial activity takes place is oftentimes logistically just a smart and more affordable stage of development for a food bank. And again, that can be aided by that research that would come from the public sector. But to Chris's point also on the academics, it doesn't have to even be a major project undertaking. It can be simply speaking to professors from economics or sociology or business that can help in all these elements. And what you'll find, at least I think our experience has been, is that even that overture, that invitation to help you think through this process, oftentimes becomes the gateway to greater stakeholder relationships in that community by people that have influence and can help then build and help further establish the food bank and its growth going forward. So those invitations are really important to helping developing local networks of support, information, and influence.
Just to delve a little deeper there into this, you mentioned people there that could do some very valuable work, and probably in most cases without charging a fee. But Chris, as you mentioned, at some point you are going to need to pay money for certain things and certain people's time as part of that planning process. How do you recommend, are there any sort of groups or types of individuals or organizations you would suggest approaching for that funding, understanding that at this point in the process, folks may not even be established as an official NGO at this point, and certainly don't have any sort of impact statistics to back up as they're not yet live?
Sure, and also because they're not registered, they don't have a bank account to be able to receive a donation of the funding and that sort of thing. And what we've seen happen in a number of different locations is that as the local leaders, the people who have conceived the idea of having a food bank in the community, begin talking among their within their networks to try and generate interest with friends and business associates or whatever, to broaden their team a little bit. Oftentimes, what we'll see is that they'll speak to as part of building that team. They will approach people who have resources, representatives from the private sector who are executives with corporations, and they're enlisting these executives to come on board and may discuss with them the need to underwrite certain costs. And so you might have a representative from one company who agrees to be part of the planning team and agrees to make available resources up to a certain level to underwrite certain costs. And so it doesn't come in the context of a donation to a non-existent food bank yet, because the non-existent food bank obviously can't receive that donation. But the person from the company who's hosting the meeting that day and providing the meals, or it might might just write off or might just take the cost of that meal and perhaps also make a direct payment for whatever service might be involved. Maybe you're paying somebody to compile the business plan in the end, and they just make that direct payment. So it becomes an in-kind donation to the planning function, and the cost is just borne by a participant in the planning side.
Again, try and utilize sort of pro bono support and in-kind donations as much as possible.
Exactly.
And related to that, we have a question about volunteers, which of course was mentioned in the presentation, the importance of volunteers. Obviously, once a food bank is established and operational, but thinking about volunteers in this phase of the planning process, what would you suggest would be the requirements for someone to join as a volunteer in terms of their education and knowledge and background? What would be an ideal?
Specifically around the business plan development part?
Yeah, I think the question relates to really at any point of the planning process as a whole.
Okay. Yeah. So obviously, going back into the very early part, the feasibility assessment, volunteers who have research skills would be really important, because as you saw in the presentation that Anna provided, there's the need to gather a lot of data, much of which already exists. You're not having to conduct original research to get the data, but what you do need to do is identify the sources from which you can collect it. So a lot of the demographic information that Anna talked about in terms of identifying the need, who in the country is at risk of hunger, and how many people are at risk of hunger, and where are they in the country? How are they dispersed across the country? And what are the gender issues, and what are the age issues, and what are the potentially special dietary issues based on the culture? Most of that information is already existent. It's a matter of identifying where it is and how to collect it. So you want volunteers who have experience conducting research and would be able to quickly move through the process of putting that together. Some of the research is going to be original research, and some of the analysis of the food system. Some of that material is going to be available. Other parts of it, not necessarily so much, and it's going to take digging around and trying to create a definition of how the system is structured. And again, you want folks who come from in that case, not just research background, but it would be great to have somebody who comes out of the food industry, the grocery products industry in the country, so that they've got a good feel for and a good understanding of how that entire industry is structured, and can assist in conducting the analysis of where the potential donation points are throughout the supply chain. So those are the first couple of ideas that come to my mind in terms of background and experience that you'd be looking for.
Yeah. So it's great to really think about what stage of the process you're at, what is the type of work, and then try and work back from there in terms of the right sort of experience and skill set.
Exactly.
Switching gears a little bit, but a question around in a particular country, there may be a lot of charities and NGOs of very different shapes and sizes that are already established with the mission of feeding people. How can a startup food bank and the food bank model sort of differentiate themselves from the crowd?
Here is where the definition of the role of the food bank and that core, if you think back to the slides and the discussion about the different models of food banking, when you think about the core, the essentially dual mission of the organization focused on mitigating hunger and mitigating food waste, and the comment that I made just a few minutes ago about what it is that you're establishing. You're not just establishing another charitable feeding operation in the community. You're establishing a food distribution business, a nonprofit food distribution business. And when you articulate that in the development of your plan and in the development of your collateral materials, so that you're demonstrating to potential stakeholders that that you're establishing yourself as both a provider to that large population of other programs that need food as part of their day-to-day services to their clients, that clearly articulates that you have a scale and scope of activity that's going to be broader and larger than the service providers that you're intending to help. Not better, because obviously you have a different mission, but different and broader scope in terms of the services that you're delivering to them. And I think that is one of the most successful approaches that I have seen in making that differentiation between, because everybody uses the term food bank, right? So some people are looking at a soup kitchen and calling it a food bank, or some people are looking at a community center where you can go and get a box of food to take home, and they call that a food bank. Which is why I spent so much time at the beginning of this webinar defining how we define food bank. It's in a much broader scope and a different level of activity.
If I just want to add to that as well, is that one other differentiation is really the kind of underlying principle is that food banks are a place like a bank, like a financial institution bank. It's meant to be a place to deposit large volume, right? So the food bank, in its kind of underlying principle, is a business solution to the problem of food loss and waste that then provides those investments, if you will, then to the service providers. Now, you may also do service provision directly from the food bank, and that certainly is, if that's what the community need is, you would be encouraged to do that. But typically the smaller entities, those agencies that you're differentiating yourself from, are more focused on the service delivery and not so much the latter, the former part, which is how do we get the product? And it's kind of like being, as Chris was saying, you're an NGO or not-for-profit business solution. You operate just like any commercial food enterprise does, but you do so not for revenue, but to provide more benefit to more people who lack food access. And that differentiation as being a different part of the supply chain, or being a different part of the service delivery chain, is really important. It in no way diminishes the role of these other entities or those agencies, but what it does, it shows how kind of critical the support you would play to their ongoing mission objectives.
And
Okay,
in
great,
fact, if I'm sorry, Tony, if I could just add one other point. In fact, it enhances them. And let me give you a quick example of a typical fear that one of those community organizations has and why they may resist the development of a food bank, right? Because when they first hear about the mission and the focus of the food bank, they may have several regular donors of product that provide food to them for their feeding program. And they may be afraid that if a food bank develops, the food bank's going to take away that donor, and that they won't have access to it anymore. And now they're going to become dependent on the food bank, or they're going to compete with the food bank to try and hold on to donors. That's a very, very common initial reaction. But if the food bank does a good job of articulating what it is intending to do, it's relatively easy to overcome that objection by helping to paint the big picture. So let's use the example of a soup kitchen that is receiving a donation from some food processor. And they may be getting that donation because for some reason years ago that relationship got established, and even though there's turnover of personnel at the processor, it's, you know, this is our charity, this is who we always help, and so we're going to continue to help them. Or maybe it's because the person that runs the agency, the soup kitchen, goes to church with the person that works in the warehouse at the company, and the person that works in the warehouse got their boss to approve giving a donation to help that soup kitchen for whatever. But especially when you're talking about processors and manufacturers, where you're talking about potential large-scale donations, when a company like that has maybe one or two or three or even a half a dozen smaller agencies that it gives support to, it's doing it from the perspective of philanthropy, and it's not doing it with the perspective of those agencies being the business solution that Doug referred to a minute ago. And so maybe that company has 1,000 cases of product a month that it potentially needs to donate. That is surplus product and it can't sell. And maybe they consume half of that in their support of a half a dozen agencies. But because they're thinking of it in context of philanthropy, they're still throwing away that other half, right? But you enter the food bank has the capacity, because of the nature of its business, to take that entire 1,000 cases. So you're mitigating more waste. You're bringing in more resource that can not only help that half dozen agencies that were already receiving part of that donation, but now more agencies can receive the rest of that donation. And that converts the thinking of the company from philanthropy to sustainability and business partnership. And that helps everybody, right? It makes a bigger pie. It doesn't mean that you're getting your piece of the pie taken away. It makes the pie bigger, so that more organizations in the community can benefit.
Okay, great, thank you. So a number of ways there that food banks can, sort of assets and capabilities that food banks have that you can utilize in your sort of materials and your planning to stand out as a slightly different model. Okay, I want to move on to the last couple of questions. And we've got two here which are very much linked, really. So this is, what should a new food bank do, or I guess a startup food bank do, if there is already an operating food bank in their country? And then the second part of that is, in that scenario, will GFN still be willing to work with me if GFN already has a member in my country?
The answer to that is it depends on the circumstances. If a startup food bank is coming together, or a group of people want to start a food bank in a country where food banking already operates, especially if there's a national network of food banks, our recommendation at GFN would be to connect the people behind that initiative with the national network, so that they can get guidance and potentially support, depending on where they're located and where the next closest members of that national network are located. They can either get guidance around developing a new food bank to be part of that national network, or engaging their resources and their energy in support of one of the existing food banks in that national network. If it's a country that's smaller and doesn't necessarily have a national network, has only one food bank or two food banks operating in the country, again, it depends on a number of different considerations, like geographic distance and societal issues around civil infrastructure and the disbursement of need throughout the country, and the availability of resource base to support another operation. GFN never wants to be in a position where we're encouraging the development of a new food bank that will end up ultimately just having to compete for resources with an existing food bank. In some cases, we do support more than one food bank in a country, but it depends on what the availability of the resource base is and how what is the potential for collaborative engagement between the food banks with that resource base in order to maximize availability of funding and food sources and volunteers and other expertise necessary to operate.
So in summary, it's a case-by-case basis, but in all cases, if there is an existing food bank, please look for ways to collaborate
Exactly.
and work together.
Exactly.
Okay, well, the final question we've got really is I think what you're going to cover, Chris, in the next steps part. So I think that's a great segue. It's basically a couple of people asking, how can we work with GFN and what are next steps? So that is a very convenient segue, I think, into wrapping up the session. So thank you, everybody, for all your questions. Thank you, Chris and Doug, for your answers. And Chris, I'll hand back to you to see us through to the close.
Sure. Well, thank you, Tony. In terms of next steps, if you are interested in moving forward with the establishment of a food bank in your community, you see on the screen now an email address, newfoodbankteam@foodbanking.org. The first thing you should do is send an email to that email address and provide some background information. Don't just send an email that says we'd like you to help us start a food bank. Tell us a little bit about what your intention is. Of course, make sure that you tell us what country and what city you're in, and we will respond to that email. We'll likely send you a questionnaire to help us learn more about your circumstances. And we'll give you access to a set of toolkits, which we're just launching actually with this webinar. It's a series of 6 toolkits focused on starting a food bank. The toolkits focus on each of the various segments of the planning process that you saw presented in the webinar today, along with some background pieces that also go a little bit more in depth into defining food banking and its impact, defining the global food banking network and our the work that we do around the world. And a little more information about how to structure the whole planning process, the discussion around the core team and the planning forum and all of that sort of thing. So the first step is contact us at newfoodbankteam@foodbanking.org. So as Tony said, that brings us to the end of our session. I want to thank all the speakers and all of you for participating. And we also want to acknowledge and thank our generous sponsor of our new food bank development work, including this webinar, PIMCO, who very generously are supporting the work that we're doing in promoting the development of food banking around the world. This session was recorded and will shortly be available, and it will be available in English, French, and Spanish. And you will receive an email in the next day or so, which will include a link to the recording, and you'll be able to access it. Also in that email will be links to several of the resources about food banking globally and to the toolkits that I just mentioned. Thank you again for participating. We look forward to being in touch with you going forward. And we wish you a good rest of the day and rest of the week.